Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello. It is so fun to be here at Revoice and to have a room full of a ton of quality people, some who I know, some who I don't know. We are Communion and Shalom, a podcast that talks about a few different things. We are here live at Revoice for those who aren't here live but are listening in a future time. So my name is David Frank, and I'll have my co-host introduce himself and a little bit more about Communion and Shalom.
Hi everyone, my name's TJ Espinoza. I'm from Mexico, the US, and I've lived a lot of my life on the African continent. I'm a student right now, and I'm happy to be here. I'm really happy to see people that I know in the audience, so hello everyone. If I know you, so happy to see you. And if I haven't met you, I hope to meet you soon. So some basics about Communion and Shalom. So our tagline is we're trying to build a space to have honest and subversive Christian conversations on sexuality, ethnicity, and what it means to live in community. We've talked a lot about Side B topics so far, and we are starting to engage ethnicity topics and community topics more over time. We really want to engage complex topics with nuance and charity. That's kind of our thing. We engage in a variety of voices. For example, in sexuality, if you've listened to us, we've talked to a lot of Side A voices. We're trying to engage more conservative voices when they're willing to talk with us. We might call them Side X and Side Y, not always willing to talk with us, but we try. And we also engage with kind of the different wings of Side B, because there's Side B, as you probably know, is multifaceted, or it's not a monolith, you might say. There's not just one way of being Side B so far. We are pretty eager to think both theologically as much as we can, as well as to kind of think maybe socioculturally, kind of bringing those two facets together, both at the same time, both integrated as best as we can, and both kind of directed towards helping people live out a good life and all these different topics we're focused on. We think a lot about being localists, like local heritage, connections to our roots. We try to approach those from our particular backgrounds. We've talked about this a bit in the past, and we usually encourage our guests to bring those perspectives into their storytelling or into their reflections overall. I would say, ultimately, we want to be a Side B podcast that you can share with anyone, and that includes straight people. Sometimes straight people feel like the conversation is hard to enter, and we want to be available for them to be able to enter the conversation. But we still are pretty unapologetically Side B, and we unapologetically center queer voices when we talk about sexuality topics. And we try to center relevant ethnic perspectives when we talk about those topics as well. So ultimately, I would say our work is for the church in the whole world, as much as we can be, even though we usually speak in English, so that usually for a certain part of the church. But we want to be for the whole church, and probably particularly for the Side B movement and project. So, thank you.
Yeah, and today we'll be talking about the social construction of sexual orientation, but we have two wonderful guests who are going to be joining with us. And so could Greg and Erin, can you y'all first introduce a little bit, tell us about yourself, for example, where you're from, who are your people, what household or local community might you be part of, what drives your life endeavors? Take a pick.
Hey folks, I'm Greg. I live in Boise, Idaho, which is a place. And I have a really beautiful life in Boise, let the record show. I'm part of a lovely little church community called RCB, which is part of the Evangelical Covenant Church of the same denomination that Michelle Sanchez is with. So when I think of my people local to my life right now, I think most of all of that community of people. Also, when I think of my people, I think of the Revoice community. I am a 6-time Revoice attendee, and I get to say 6 because I even attended the Revoice in 2020 that happened only online when 20 of us met in an Airbnb in St. Louis to live stream the conference to anyone else. I was in the Airbnb. So Revoice is another set of people with whom I find great alignment and delight.
There we go. Hi, my name is Erin. I am from North Carolina. I'm a member of the Waccamaw Nation and the Lumbee Nation, both local to the southeastern part of North Carolina. So that's one definition of who my people are. I am also well connected with a lot of Side B believers in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live. I live with 2 other Side B brothers, and I'm also a part of starting a new community alongside what some of you may know as Your Other Brothers, with Thomas, Mark, Zanika. We're working together to make a community like Your Other Brothers for women and for our siblings and beyond. And anything else?
Any questions from the audience yet? Rare. Awesome. Thank you all. I'm so glad to be together with y'all. Especially in the Revoice community, there's like so many faces you know from afar. And so it's such a delight to be face to face, especially after that COVID year. Little closer. Okay, thank you. That's Elena, our podcast manager. Can we give a round of applause for Elena? So, to start us out, we're going to have Dr. Gregory Coles give us a short introduction on what in the world is social construction.
It's like we've stepped into a college classroom, which is a feeling that brings me great delight. So social construction, and work with me. Feel free to interrupt. You know, if you've got questions, comments, concerns, interrupt, as one should do in a good college classroom. Social construction is a way that we name anything that isn't inherent in its physicality or its being, but society chooses to interact with it in such a way that it becomes real to us. So the easiest way to kind of get a hold of this is to think of some examples. So when we think of red hair and blonde hair, let's just poll the audience. How many of you would say red hair and blonde hair are 2 different colors of hair? Okay, we've got general unanimity on the subject. Would anyone say that red hair and blonde hair are actually the same color of hair? Any takers? So when I was growing up, I grew up in Indonesia. This is a fun fact about me. I grew up in Indonesia, and in Indonesia, we have a single word to describe those 2 hair colors. We call them pirang. And pirang is anything that is basically, if it's lighter than brown, it counts as pirang. And we don't really need to differentiate between the 2 because there's just not a lot of people with red or blonde hair in Indonesia. And it means that categorically we think of people with those 2 types of hair as having the same color of hair. And when I moved to America, people would ask me like, oh, what color is her hair? And I would be like, it's blonde. And they would be like, she is bright strawberry red, Coles. Do you not have eyes inside of your head? And I was like, I don't know. It's like a pirang color. Like it's just a... So this is one of those things. And language, of course. My PhD is in rhetorical theory, which is kind of like the philosophy of how language interacts with society. And so language becomes a really big way that we construct things socially. We put language around them, and then as soon as we have language, it starts to feel inherent that we chop up the world that way. Moving to an example that's maybe a little more spicy. I mean, we're about to get to sexual orientation, so like spicy is just the name of the game. But race is another good example of something that isn't inherent and yet comes to feel inherent by the way we interact with it as a society, right? So there's nothing inherent about me that says, oh, you, Coles, should think of yourself as white, and then when you see someone of Irish descent rather than someone of German descent, you should think like, oh yeah, we're both like pretty similar because we're both white. And yet, I live in a society where the boxes of race have been constructed, and not just arbitrarily, but those boxes have been at various points in history constructed very specifically to make certain kinds of in-groups and out-groups. And now that those boxes exist, part of my responsibility as someone interacting with society is to be able to name and engage with those boxes. And so if I just say, oh, well, race is a construct, so I don't have to think about it, then I absolve myself of the responsibility of recognizing that for hundreds of years, literally the nation that I live in, the nation that we now inhabit, so much of the way it was built up has been around constructions that make sure that people of a certain race are elevated at the expense of other races. And so even though it's socially constructed, it's incredibly real to who we are, our history, how we engage with the world. So this is the category of social construction that we will now bring to our conversation of sexual orientation.
So to kick us off, sexual orientation, it's kind of funny. It's like a meta conversation we're having here. It's like around sexuality, also gender conversations, but it's like, oh, we're all here, right? We know what sexual orientation is. A lot of our friends maybe don't, and that's why we find solidarity here. But there's different ways that, I have a beef with people who, as you were saying, like, oh, it's just a social construct, so I don't want to deal with it. And it's like, well, no, this is an active, like, category in our day and age. Like, please try to understand it. Please try to understand the conversations that are happening because it bears on reality. But on the other hand, also bump into people who hold this social construct as if it is specifically sexual orientation, as if it is the most defining characteristic of what it means for them to be them. And so it's this question of how do we hold sexual orientation in our understanding? And personally, for me, knowing that sexual orientation as a category didn't exist before about the 1880s starts to make me just question of like, wait, what does that mean? You know? How do we think about this? And another way that I valued this kind of like a little factoid that makes me re-question how I hold sexual orientation is mixed orientation marriages, because it's very common. You're like, oh, I'm gay, so that means in order to find a satisfying life, much of our culture will say, I have to marry someone of my same sex, and I have to find sexual satisfaction there. And then you see someone who's gay and married to the opposite sex, and it's just like the paradigm starts shifting, and it doesn't fit how we've constructed what sexual orientation means, and in conversation with what sexuality means, and what sex means, and what companionship means, but a lot of it is on sexual orientation. So sometimes we have sexual orientation being kind of ignored, and sometimes we have it kind of being upheld too highly in a way that feels awkward and inappropriate for an idea that just came about 140 years ago and has still been in development since then about how we think about it. Can you give a little thumbs up? So thumbs up will be like, I am pretty like confident in understanding the history of how sexual orientation has developed in these last 120 years. And, you know, like this is like, I'm kind of aware of it, and thumbs down is like, what are you talking about? Can I get a little from the audience? Okay, we got some variety. Great. So I'm going to have my friends jump in, be like, hey, you missed something, or that's incorrect, because I'm not an expert on this. My training is in mechanical engineering. It has nothing to do with this. You guys have heard of our good friend Sigmund Freud. He is known something like the father of psychology. And this is, I'm trying not to get off on tangents. So as, you know, it's like, okay, how does the brain work? How are we thinking? How do we think of ourselves? All this stuff is developing in the late 1800s. But initially, these terms are coming about with Freud and his contemporaries of homosexual and heterosexual. What's interesting is that those terms initially were only meant to describe abnormal people. Those terms didn't describe the normal population. They were basically heterosexuals were people who had like maybe sex addicts in the heterosexual direction. and homosexuals were those who couldn't control their sexual behavior with the same sex. And over time, that developed to more broad categories in the early 1900s as there started with the increase of urbanization, especially in the U.S. city centers, especially in New York City. There became a lot of people were being dispersed from their home communities. A lot of single people, a lot of men were living together at, just working in the industrial city, lacking their previous communities, and there began to form some, what today we might call queer communities. And people started seeing, there's this homosexual behavior going on. Those that must be homosexuals. And so the psychologists were trying to figure out what's going on with them. They're diagnosing them as having homosexuality. But it developed in the culture where heterosexual eventually fell off from being a diagnosis and started being the norm of the normal way to live is as a heterosexual, and then there are those homosexual people. And so it moved from like kind of not abstract, but like this kind of psychological categories to started more culturally being able to identify a group of people as homosexuals based off of their behavior. But it took it's still been, there's many decades of that still being this clinical category where psychologists were like, okay, why did the homosexuals exist as they exist? What happened in their childhood or something else happened? Can we give them shock therapy to get rid of the homosexuality out of their brain? All this is developing in culture. And eventually, skipping stuff I forget about, these words then enter into our language. Kind of interestingly, around 1920, the same time that homosexuality and heterosexuality as more cultural common language is introduced, we also have the new concept of introverts and extroverts. Because also, with the development of psychology, there's lots of different things we're looking at, how do we operate differently from one another? And so previous to 1920s, you can say there were no such thing as introverts or extroverts. Now, of course, we know that didn't just happen, we didn't create introversion in the 1920s, but in a sense we did. And this is the complexity here, that's we didn't have to decide to construct it in these ways that we did, but we come from a particular history. And then you have ways that the church and biblical interpretations were using these new categories and started using heterosexual in certain biblical translations. Homosexual. And now it's conflating what previously would have only been describing behavior, but now in early 1900s America, we're starting to think of these as psychological differences between people. And this can also explain a lot of the generational differences and as well as geographical cultural differences of cultures that have not invested a lot of time in American psychology don't have these social constructs of orientation as a psychological phenomenon. So when they engage with heterosexuality and homosexuality, they are thinking mainly on behavior levels, and we're thinking on psychological levels. But what does it mean for us to have these categories? I'll make it personal. It's still am I gay? Wait, or maybe am I bi? I thought that one girl was cute that one time. How straight am I? Okay, we have a Kinsey scale, so it's a spectrum. It's not just different categories. And but there's demisexuality. Maybe half of you haven't even heard of that. And it's just what's helpful and what's not helpful. And I think that's a lot of our general church space is just saying, let's just take 10 steps back from any of this, maybe throw it in the dumpster, burn it, and let's move on with biblical faithfulness. And there's people like Jackie Hill Perry. It's hard to place her in terms of what side she's in, because I think she's generally, we could call her side B, but she is just will also say like, sexual orientation is kind of a new concept. I'm not sure how on board I am with it. So my more poignant question, are you on board with sexual orientation?
I'm on board. Well, okay, so I promise this will be a short tangent, but now I've got myself in college classroom mode, so we're going to have to run with it. I wrote my dissertation in part on this guy named Kenneth Burke, who was a 20th century rhetorical theorist. And he has this phrase in his book, Permanence and Change, which I would tell you should read, but you probably shouldn't. But in Permanence and Change, he has this line, he says, a way of seeing is also a way of not seeing. He talks about how psychologists, so for instance, when chickens are trained to run to get fed when a bell is rung, that can be a really handy mechanism to feed your chickens, and also when it's time to slaughter the chickens, it's a really handy mechanism to gather the chickens for slaughter. And so what he says is like, the chickens have learned a really good and useful way of living that serves them well to respond to this particular kind of input with a particular response. It works really well until it doesn't. And so everything becomes simultaneously advantageous and incapacitating, right? It both gives you something really good, and in the same moment that it offers that really good thing with the one hand, it kind of pulls back something really good with the other hand, which is very much how I feel personally about the concept of sexual orientation. It has been incredibly useful for me at various points in my life. You know that meme where the guy's like, thanks, but I'm gay? I find myself at many points in my life being like, this helps to explain some of my interaction with the world. Thanks, but I'm gay. And it's just handy. It's helpful to be able to put some language around that. And yet at the same time, the sort of endless partitioning of humankind into ever more minute groups, such that your affinity group can only be like the Swedish Kayakers Club, and it's like, we're pretty narrow at this point. I think labeling has such utility, and at the same time, it can become a way of missing something of our shared humanity. And so I find myself, this is a very Enneagram 9 answer, right? And even as I label myself an Enneagram 9, I have once again partitioned myself. But it's useful to me in this communicative moment to say, my impulse as an Enneagram 9 is to be like, well, this part of this is really helpful, but let's consider the utility of this over here. Like, everything is good in its own way. Like, shut up, Enneagram 9, So yeah, that's my answer. I love it and I hate it.
Yeah, I feel very similarly. I think labels can help us understand ourselves better, or like put one word to something that has like 1,000 behind it. Kind of like a picture, right? A label can be kind of like a picture for us to explain or to seek to be understood, but they can often be seen as labels to, like you're saying, put us in a box, or I guess especially in the area of sexual orientation, identity, these words were used and constructed by people who didn't really interact with them, I would say. So we have these prefixes that are also a bit confusing, like the prefix by. How many native English my background is in English language learning, and I'm also bisexual, for whatever that means, for what it's worth, I guess. But how many times do I hear fluent and native English speakers say, bi-weekly, do you mean like twice a week or every other week? Even in that common usage, it's so confusing. So imagine that being applied to our own sexuality. I was talking to TJ yesterday about, God is so mysterious, and God has created sexuality, and I think people try to quantify God in terms and identities, and again, those things can be very useful, but can also maybe be like a stumbling block or some sort of means in which we think we've figured God out, and we miss out on the mystery of God. And in the same way, in this area, we can miss out on the mystery of sexuality as well.
Something that I think about, so I'm a social scientist by background, and I think that, similar to what Greg said, there's something of attending, where your attention is drawn. That is what human beings are doing with categories. How do you draw attention to here? That intrinsically creates silences. There's things that the attention is not focused towards. In some of the discussion on sexuality, they sometimes talk about, in the Greco-Roman era, which obviously was engaging with the Christian era in New Testament times and after. There was different ways of categorizing what we might call sexual orientation, and that was more focused on who in these relationships was penetrated versus a penetrator. I know that's a bit crass, but it's the easiest way I can talk about it. And that is relevant to Christian sexual ethics, I guess, in some way. But over time, seemingly in the Christian West particularly, which they started focusing on these human beings who had these consistent behavior patterns, right? And at first that was just, as you mentioned, just act focused, the sodomites, and that was bad. They didn't really talk about patterns of attractions, which we've eventually talked about more. But it also merged with our contemporary movement from to psychology, as you mentioned too. And there's sort of this big shift in social sciences from the moral way of engaging the world. In the past, a lot of theologians use moral categories, moral ways of viewing the world. But then when social sciences and applying quantitative math to human beings and human populations emerged, that's when people started making these categories for human beings who consistently are doing something, for example, homosexual. There's going to be some human beings who consistently try to sexually engage with people of the same sex. So drawing attention to that fact, that's not a fact that all human beings care about, but the Christian European West or whatever did care about that fact based on their theological presuppositions that same-sex sex is vicious or it's a vice or it's wrong or whatever. I think sexual orientation is valuable, though I try to accept your critique that you always bring that we have to hold it carefully. Because I think I would generally agree with you. There can be ways that you can bring your whole self and make it revolve around this one thing. And in the Christian tradition, in the Christian perspective, the Christian lens, is that faithfulness? Yes or no? And it doesn't have to be all yes. It doesn't have to be all no. It can be nuanced, But what do we do with this sort of potentially nuanced take that maybe the church is trying to teach, rather than all bad, all good? Something along those lines.
TJ, I know you have also thought about maybe alternative ways that we can be thinking about what it means to be queer. How does that factor into, is that sexual orientation still? Can you explain that a little bit and how you think about it?
Yeah. I define queer just as a special affinity for the same sex. That's all I do, and I do that because I think that includes more types of people. It might include asexual people who are mostly drawn to the same sex. It includes queer people who never have sex because they're celibate. It includes queer people who have sex a lot because they're still drawn to the same sex. But I like it because it reduces the idea of queer people just being sexual monsters. They just want sex, they just want sex. But it also evokes that if you've been in side B conversations for a while, you've probably heard that a lot of side B queer people, at least, they think that being queer is more than just about their sexual desires or their drives. And my definition in that way is trying to attach, get all those points to be sort of a general way, because we mean something when we say queer, or any of those terms, gay, lesbian, whatever. But sometimes what we mean is not clear, and it's become more unclear over time as more people take up the terms and as the conversation develops. So,
do you all have maybe advice for the church on how to construct? Well, we can both either zoom in, construct around sexual orientation well, how do we embed that in our culture well, or you can zoom out of what is the Christian way for assessing the usefulness of these different labels, these different categories that we're creating. When is it biblical or unbiblical to create a certain label?
So one thing that I find helpful, and I think for me, I'm far less interested in being like, okay, you're using orientation language and that was the wrong choice. Or like, you're not using orientation language and that would really be the right choice. But what I'm interested in largely is how the language we do or don't use points us toward a certain kind of end game, a certain kind of telos for ourselves. Because I think I think our use or non-use of sexual orientation language can be helpful or harmful in the ways we think about the direction of our lives. So, for instance, I remember having a conversation once with somebody who they were coming out to me as bisexual, and they were like, and so I'm just not sure how I can really fully be myself until I've like had some sexual experiences with both men and women and kind of be fully myself. And I was like, I'm gay and I've never had sexual experiences with men, you know, like, do I count still? You know, are we revoking my gay card? But it was as if the language of sexual orientation had given this person a sort of narrative of inevitability. This is my orientation, and therefore there is one logical and natural telos for my life. And so that, it seems to me, is not a point at which I'm like, the solution is to stop calling yourself gay, right? But I think that can be an invitation for us to sort of slow down and unpack, like, hey, when you say you're gay, what does that mean to you? And apart from your adoption of this particular category, how can we think about how the way you see your life ordered reflects the kind of vision that God might have for your life versus the kind of vision that you might simply see assumed within the category you've adopted. And conversely, I think in the camp that would sort of avoid language at all costs, I think there can be a loss of being able to envision the good future of one's life. Right? I think before I started understanding myself as a celibate gay person, I thought of myself in this kind of perpetual holding pattern. Like I was just kind of waiting around to eventually be sufficiently heterosexual that my life could finally begin, because that was the telos I had heard. Like, oh, everybody's just kind of the same in this sexuality thing, and everybody's eventually supposed to get married and have 2.3 children. And I was like, it'll come. Just hold on in faith, you know? And so being able to adopt a label that kept me from that holding pattern and actually gave me something of a telos. Labels, have any of you seen the Netflix show Dear White People? What a fascinating time. But there's this line where I think the guy who says it, his name is Lionel. Or it's said to Lionel, I don't remember, not important. But one character has said to another, like, well, as a gay black man, and the other guy's like, oh, I'm not gay. And the first guy's like, oh, I'm sorry, are you straight? And he was like, well, I just don't identify myself with any labels. And the first guy says, labels keep people in Florida from drinking Windex. And I think about that a lot. Like, the value of the label is that it gives you some sort of instruction about life, and it helps you see some ways forward, and it helps keep you away from some ways forward that are unconstructive for your life, like the consumption of Windex. And so I think in both cases, like, sometimes I hear people use orientation language, and I'm like, I'm concerned about what that means for your telos, your vision of what life is. And in some cases, I hear people being like, I transcend orientation. And I'm like, I'm also concerned about your telos. But I'm less interested in the language or the non-language and more interested in, like, where are you going?
Question from the audience? Yeah.
I could point you to specific sources, but I've been doing a lot of reading on the history of like queer culture in particular, and how the adoption of terms like gay, lesbian, queer, bi, etc., like the reclamation of queer, has really been in response to the hypersexualization of sexual minorities. So I guess, like, I'm wondering if you can speak to that development in the language, you know, that we're using in the social constructs here, because it really was the goal of the LGBT community to say, like, our sexual orientation, or rather, like, our queerness is so much more than just
to rephrase that.
Yeah, so this language was appropriated by queer people, maybe in resistance towards forms of oppression, to the over-sexualization of people like this. I was going to say before, I think Greg Coles does stuff related to this particularly, but it's funny that we talk about this conversation, but this conversation is also in the context of Side B. And Side B as a movement, in my opinion, one of the central pillars has been, like, we're okay with the language, like, it's all about the wisdom. Because usually the people, the more like conservative wings, which the people we are not, they're usually the ones who become very annoyed by these languages and don't usually want to participate in sort of the politics of resistance that these languages sometimes have been evoking, right? So yeah, so we're having this conversation, but I think I want to recognize that we're kind of middling. We're in a middle position amidst the spectrum of perspectives on like these particular terms. So. Yeah. So I don't want you to think we're side Y or side X right now in space, because that's what we're trying to do. But there still is some of these questions that have emerged, especially for David Frank, and continue to come up. So yeah.
And actually learning the history of, and even the acronym LGBTQ, how we're combining multiple conversations into one, and just reasons for that. And growing a sympathy for what have the communities that preceded me experienced. And there's a pastor who, I remember him saying, like, if you are LGBT or you are associated with that, whether you feel whether you like that or not. And there's this sense, I think, for at times with Christians, it's like, oh, I have, come to realize I have these associations or shared psychology with people from a community that I haven't previously had a history with. And it's an interesting phenomenon to step into a different community's kind of history, and how do you do that well? And I so love being at Revoice to learn from others who have both in their own life experiences, kind of more grown up in various queer communities, and those who have engaged missiologically really well. And it's, Jesus said to be in the world but not of it. And I think the of is not a language game. There's people who have, I just want, that wisdom of how do we continue to be in it well. And I don't know if Greg has more words towards reclamation and how specifically we've come about to some of these ways that circle around sexual orientation.
I'll offer a couple thoughts on reclamation. So with the word queer specifically, so reclamation of queer starts becoming a thing around 1990. There's a really famous moment where a group called Queer Nation creates this pamphlet that says in all caps, "Queers read this," and they distribute it at a pride march in New York City. And a big part of the argument, and maybe you've read, it's Amy, right? Maybe you've read that pamphlet, Amy. If not, I would highly recommend it to you because it's a fascinating and distressing read. But a big part of the argument that's being made in that pamphlet has to do with the AIDS crisis and the oversight of the AIDS crisis by the majority world, which is largely occurring because queer people have been conceived of by the rest of U.S. society as being this group that is sufficiently other that when they start mysteriously dying, it's not really a big deal, right? It becomes a joke in the media cycle for years before it's seen as like a serious health crisis. And so a big part of the argument being made in the Queers Read This pamphlet is, look, we're dying, and so we need to start naming ourselves in a way that's sufficiently uncomfortable, in a way that is sufficiently disruptive that we can finally draw enough attention to be able to advocate for ourselves. And so there is, with queer especially, there's a desire to see linguistic disruptivity as that's sort of like top shelf priority. Whereas a word like gay which also significantly, gay is not, it's not derogatory before it begins being used for sexual orientation, whereas queer, of course, has a long history of derogation beginning in like the late 19th century. But gay is generally seen as, you know, a positive word that means something else. And then in around 1970, we see a movement where they take the Black is Beautiful movement, which has reclaimed the word black. A couple other groups are like, oh, that was a really good idea. What a great campaign. We should do that with our word. And so gay is one of those other words where I think it might be like the North American Homophile Association, or it has some name that now seems wildly archaic. But there's a pro-gay group that tries to start a similar campaign that they call Gay is Good. And the Gay is Good campaign, unlike the Queers Read This campaign for the reclamation of queer, Gay is Good is much more about saying, hey, insofar as you think of this word as being related to sexual orientation, you may have a negative sex-only view of it, but we want to cast this vision of like the whole lives of gay people. And so I think that movement in particular, Amy, sort of speaks to the dynamic you're describing, where there's this desire in the Gay as Good movement to sort of cast the whole life of the gay person as being much more than simply the sexual act.
Any other thoughts or questions from the audience?
I kind of, jumping off of that, naming as self-determination, kind of like Black is Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Where before it was like somewhat neutral, but because American society, neutral in the way that American society thought this was derogatory, but this is the term that's really called. I kind of do want to advocate for labels in that way, specifically labels in that come out of the desire to self-determine, because it feels relatively consistent that the labels we're talking about come out of depression, which everyone's mentioned already. And not just depression, but outside recognition. Everyone else was already recognizing these people over there, the others. And kind of, I guess my personal experience was kind of a mix. David mentioned like engaging in another culture. For me, even though I grew up in a Christian home, Christian family, going to church, that's the holiness, so 7 days a week, all day, every day, that's what we do. Also, most of my friend group was not straight, which we found out over time. So those people were already us. And the things that we're hearing in church about those people, each of those persons in that friend group is internalizing about themselves. So this desire to then, it's so interesting to me how we put the desire to positively name ourselves under a microscope, as if people weren't already under a microscope, always, whatever they were called. I just don't get it. I'm like, yeah, people want to be called something nice, guys. Like, they want to name themselves. They want to determine their own future. They want to, or say, God has a better determined future for me than either you or I could come up with. And this is what I call myself. Gives language to that. And we've already known, right? It doesn't happen in isolation. But I haven't found yet in history when we're talking about people who are attracted to the same sex, where there isn't, especially in Western cultural history, a need to find community, not be alone, surprise and joy upon discovering others, and for a lot of Western cultural history, because a lot of it is Christian, this need to then reconcile what does that mean to be a Christian in this, because there's already something out here.
Thank you so much. For those who, I'm not going to try to sum that up. And you're just going to have to buy a ticket to Revoice and go hang out with your hands. Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, we had another question.
I just wanted to ask Erin, what's in your indigenous culture, what kind of labels you used, and how does that impact how you see your sexuality when you're in your own culture, your home culture, and when you're out in the broader American context?
So I guess to summarize, like how maybe something like how would I identify within the culture, maybe versus how I identify typically.
What words are available to you in your
Yeah, so a really common way to identify is two-spirit. A lot of indigenous tribes have this history of a person who kind of experiences masculine and feminine traits, could be attributed to two-spirit. Someone who may be attracted to the same sex may also be described as two-spirit. It really just depends on the tribe and the region and so many other factors. But I think it's beautiful, that idea two-spirit. So internally, I just take that to fully, or like more fully speak to the nature of the meaning behind the labels that we use. Like possessing traits that may be attributed to historically more masculine people or more feminine people, because I also relate to that too. My pronouns would be she, her, but I think part of queerness is to also maybe challenge or shake up typical notions of how women or more feminine people should act and how more masculine people should act. So, yeah, like at large, when I came out to my parents, I knew I couldn't say labels because I come from a really, I think, Johanna, she said Pentecostal holiness. Yeah. I'm from a very similar background. I grew up Church of God, if that means anything to anybody. So when I came out to my parents, I just said, hey, I just want you guys to know that I am attracted to men and women. I knew that was a language that they could handle, and that was what was true. And I knew that I couldn't mention, like, I'm attracted to people despite their gender representation, because that wouldn't have been heard. Yeah, when I think about my sexuality, I think of it as a mystery, and I think that also goes back to Native identity, and embracing Creator God as mystery as well. And then kind of relating back to what I said earlier, that sexuality is a mystery created by an even more mysterious being that we're privileged to know. So, yeah.
One thing, so my progression, when I was young, I was taught not to use any labels, right? Like, we don't talk about this. And over time, and I started getting involved, I guess I should say, maybe in Side B in 2017-ish. And that was my entrance point to being more devoted in English in the US to using some of these terms, right? And I do that in part because it is a resistance to the dominant forces, like the kind of more dominant cultural context, which is oppressive to queer people. And I use the terms explicitly in order to both connect with people who also are using the same terminology in the English-speaking US context. So it's like a politics, like we recognize each other, it's recognition. But also to be like, no, I'm a Christian. No, I'm queer. No, I'm doing this thing. Like, I'm following your sexual ethic too. You know, like, I'm also a disciple, and this is also part of me. It's not all of me, but it's part of me. But then the problem is, I mentioned I lived a lot of my life on the African continent, and I don't use the labels because that's more dangerous. I don't use indigenous labels for what would be that, and I don't use English labels for what I could be called, which would be gay, basically. And I kind of wonder, well, should I start trying to use those labels, even though it's in an even more actually like legally sanctioned oppressive states to stop like harm queer people? So I have that tension. Like, I do this in the U.S., I don't do this here. Does that mean I'm not being sufficiently resistant towards the oppressive forces that are actually want to hurt queer people? Yeah. And I don't know how to solve that tension yet. And I don't know So anyways, I struggle with the labels only in that regard. Only in like another part of my life, I struggle with using them. But in the U.S., I feel very free. So it's some sort of bifurcation. I don't know what to do with that. So.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Greg.
can I just wanted to riff off both that and a comment on something Johanna Marie said earlier, which is that I think as our language interacts with systems that can advantage certain people and disadvantage other people simultaneously, there can be a lot of value, not just in labeling the minority experience, but also in labeling the majority experience. I'm thinking, for instance, Toni Morrison has a really wonderful, she's got lots of wonderful literature, but she also has this really fabulous book about the invisibility of whiteness in American literature. And what she does is point out that there's this whole history of American literature in which if race is named, race is black. And when race is unnamed, it's just the thing that is assumed, which just conveniently happens to be white. And so she argues that the naming that's most necessary for the response to that system is actually not the naming of blackness, it's the naming of whiteness, the recognition that there is this unstated and assumed thing. And sometimes I think that I'm less interested in naming myself as gay and just more interested in calling the straights straight. And to be clear, I love the straights. So glad that some of you are here. But I think sometimes what we need is more interrogation of that category, because I think there's a lot of power in that.
One thing in my work one thing in my discipline that I work on a lot is we're trying to excavate the silences, like the silences of the histories of people. That again, the things that we draw attention to are dominant, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But the things that remain silent or hidden, those are often subtly more powerful than even the dominant frames at play. So I think we need to interrogate that silence, evacuate it, name the straight people if they're going to name the queer people, all these things. And sometimes that recognition of I say you're gay, but I'm straight, but you're calling me straight, whatever. That can be sometimes that spark that moves people to deeper reflection or a new orientation to the world, or walking on a new trajectory in life. And I think there's a power in that. And sometimes the power could be also in telling on histories that weren't known previously. So,
love to keep it open to the audience for other thoughts and questions.
Something that I struggle with is that, so I come from a Latin American culture, my family is Dominican, and my grandma doesn't speak English, and so there's the language barrier, literally dialect, but then there's also the gap of the fact that she just was raised in an entirely different cultural context, where there's this discourse around these words that are so loaded, and I feel in the U.S. American Christian conversation, it's should I use the word? I don't like that. That's not cool. It's just the questions that I'm asking are so different because the words I don't have the words, and then also the words don't have as much of the connotations or the baggage in the way that they do in English in the U.S. American context. Yeah, I don't know. I guess some of you have mentioned that you're coming from a different cultural context. How do you navigate these conversations that have become so intellectualized and humanize the conversation, but then also what's underneath the words? I don't know if that makes sense. The words, that conversation feels like such a surface level thing. I don't know. I feel like I asked 7 questions.
It's Giselle, is that right? CL, sorry. Just something short. When I talk to people who don't interact with labels, like my family or maybe with older folks, that I just want them to get the content. I would rather them just understand the words that I'm saying. I do stay away from labels because ultimately I know, and ultimately I can use whatever labels I can to describe myself. And thankfully I have people that I can freely use whatever. But when I'm talking to family or when I'm talking to people, I just want them to hear me. So I do stay away from labels.
I think about how much there's, just the social aspect of our labels that we're finding kind of a solidarity with each other. And there's times of like, what's those who are finding that solidarity, what are the things that we are trying to describe? And this is more just a funny anecdote with an Afghanistan neighbor who's learning English, and he comes from a culture of deep homophobia where he's from, and that's now being mixed with kind of like global youth culture and now in America. And so he's associating these kind of dynamics with the gays that he sees, walking around in Minneapolis. And I'm like, how do I talk to him? And a fun term that I was like, well, there's gay in the way maybe you think of it in Afghanistan, and then there's gay in the heart. And I'm gay in the heart.
So I think I said that's similar to what you're describing. So I don't know if this makes me unique, but I've had to figure out how to come out, or came out in 3 languages, and I didn't use gay for any of those words, any of them. So, but I had to say, one was in Spanish, one is in English, one is in African language, and none of those labels, even indigenous labels, I didn't use them, but I basically said, and one of them, this made sense in the context. I said, I'm more attracted to the bodies of men than women. And that made sense. And then I said, in my life, I plan to focus on having many brothers. And that was how I tried to humanize what the actual situation was. Like, basically, I'm queer, I'm gay, and whatever, what the situation was. And my end, like the telos, like teleology of my life that I anticipated, right? To try to say marriage, maybe that won't happen, but this will happen. And actually, it's worked so far. That's what I'll say. And even the different languages, this works so far when used. So that was enough for me to get the basic point across. And then there's a lot more subsequent conversations about what to do, what about that, but that was enough for the first conversations. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's always a question for me of like when someone's like, oh, you want to get married? When do I say, oh, I'm not straight, or when, and often I find myself just more naturally responding, I'm actually really excited to build community with singleness. And then if they follow up with more questions, how God led me there can play into it. I think we have time for one more question or inspirational thought from the audience.
Thank you all so much. This is so great and insightful. My mind is spinning. I'm a pastor, mainly working with college students in Ann Arbor, also thinking about youth because my kids are 15 and younger, and go to Christian school. We just had this task force on trying to find some material to help them engage with sexuality and gender, like 9th grade going into this high school years. So you have any thoughts on just how to talk about this with high schoolers, with college students in a way that invites more conversation, in a way that invites them, that some of them are wrestling with their sexuality, some of them don't know, some of them have been, influenced a lot by their peers or media or whatever, but are trying to reconcile that with scripture and their faith that's really young. They're figuring out how to own for the first time on their own. So I'd love to find ways to talk about it that doesn't shut it down, the conversation, but invites more. But they also have so many labels and things going on in their heads, at this time of life. So that was my main question. If you just have thoughts or insights, how to talk to the next generation. Thank you.
This is not, please jump in. It's not full advice, but one thing I've been toying with as I work with high schoolers at my church is how much just to try to encourage the youth to put brakes on finding their sexual orientation label and category. Of just orientation is this, describe, it's a set, it's a, what you have seen over time for your desires and attractions to be. And that is something that requires kind of a historical mapping. So as you are going through puberty right now, just start tracking. You can journal about it, but maybe wait till you're in your 20s or something. I know some people like know very early on, and I don't want to like keep people from like naming it, but I think there's a certain like eagerness. I need to find out who I am, and I want to encourage orientation is a long discernment process, and inviting them into that discernment and saying, but you don't have to come to a conclusion anytime soon.
I'm sorry, I just have to make such a relevant comment about this.
Yes.
I saw a post online. I was like, stop asking kids what they want to be when they get older, because you ask them that and the conversation shuts down if they don't have like, oh, I want to be a fireman off the top of their head. Instead, ask kids in particular, right? Like, what did you do recently that you were proud of? Like, what filled you with a sense of pride about, I'm really glad that I did this sort of thing, and that will help guide you in the future. So I feel like asking these sorts of questions about like, take note of how you are feeling about your attraction to various people, and make those observations over time instead of trying to be like, this is what I am. Definitively. Yeah, I really think it's a very similar sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
That's definitely something that I think could go hand in hand on how a lot of church people talk to single people. Like, oh, when are you going to get married? Instead, focus on, hey, what are you working on? Like, what are you spending your days with? Something that acknowledges that you view that person as valuable regardless of what they're contributing to like a heteronormative society. Like, oh, when are you getting married? When are you going to have kids? Those are always the questions, right? You get married, and then the next question people ask, oh, when are you having kids? When are you? Instead, to just acknowledge the person in the moment as they are, as someone valued, but not necessarily how they can contribute to this ideal, I guess. I guess to go back to your question, there are so many good resources. I'd say if you haven't already, to definitely look at Peter Volk's resources. And you're nodding, I guess you have. But yeah, there's so many different resources here, like with Kaleidoscope and with Posture Shift. There's so many people that can give you the tools and maybe equip you to do that work. It's really hard work.
The other kind of, TJ talked about what we're exploring in our podcast, and a lot of it is around roots. And for, I think myself, coming out of a generation that loves our personality tests, loves to know what psychological type am I, and it's, and it's because we all just want to be so special, and we are also special, and God loves us and has so much creativity poured into each one of us, but so much of that is embedded in like the who we are is always connected to like who we belong to and where we're from. And so being able to not throw out, the Myers-Briggs necessarily, or my more loved Enneagram, but to incorporate it also of like, and now what's your genealogy? What are these other parts of you that tell you about who you are, and what's hard about that? What's good about that? What's beautiful about that? What's unique? And I think that's just really valuable to all of our formation as humans who bear the image of God and are always embedded as persons in relationship. And so I think that's just a part of youth formation that isn't going to come naturally through a lot of media.
Two other quick thoughts around talking with young folks that I found helpful. One is, in the same way that it can be helpful to encourage them to kind of slow down the conversation and like, you don't have to rush, like there's no final exam, you don't have to pick a label tomorrow. I also think it can be helpful on the adult side of the conversation to slow ourselves down and say like, I don't have to cover all of this ground simultaneously, right? I can have a conversation that just says, historically the church did some really awful things to LGBTQ people, and that's really sad and that breaks God's heart. And that's a whole conversation. And there's a whole nother conversation that literally is just, some people are called to marriage and some people are called to singleness, and those are both really beautiful, and that's an entire conversation. And we can piece those things together, right? It's not like, every time LGBTQ comes up, I need to give a whole excursus on like the history of the church and sexual ethics. And I think sometimes we have such a sense of urgency to I got to get it out all right now. And I think in the same way that we encourage kids to slow it down, we can kind of slow it down too. Concurrent with that, I think it's really helpful insofar as this is possible. I think it's perhaps only possible with the Lord's help. But I think all the most fruitful conversations about this with young people happen non-anxiously. And I think it's really easy as adults to get very amped up about if I do it just right and I say just the right thing, I will cause this child to grow up in the way he or she or they should go. It seems to me that we don't actually have that control over people. And by trying to give ourselves a sense of that control, we wind up interacting about these conversations with a kind of anxiety that's actually really off-putting. And so I think to the degree we can be the kind of peaceful people who reflect hey, here's what I understand to be good and beautiful, and you and Jesus are going to have to sort through that in your own time, but I would be glad to help you understand how I have understood this. Those are two thoughts.
I just want to say as final, a resource recommendation. You should check out Eden Invitation. They're Side B and Catholic, and they don't get as much airtime in the Side B spaces as they really should get, in my opinion. So I would definitely, maybe Protestant, or maybe Orthodox, or maybe whatever, but check out Eden Invitation, I think. Eden, yep. It's like the garden, yeah. We're going to wrap up, but would you all please give a round of applause for our much appreciated Greg?
Hey listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.